We're always hearing about taxes, right? Who pays, how much, where it all goes. But what if?
Mm.
What if there's a huge tax hike happening that most people haven't really clocked?
Hmm.
Okay, let's really get into this because there's this pretty striking analysis from across the pond, The Telegraph, the big conservative paper in the UK.
Yeah, yeah, I saw that.
They've published this really quite forceful piece criticizing Donald Trump's tariffs. They're actually suggesting they could be the largest tax hike in history.
Which is, wow, coming from them especially.
Exactly. That's what makes it so interesting. For a publication like The Telegraph, which usually, champions free markets, smaller government, for them to slam a policy that's often framed as pro-American industry, it really makes you stop and think, doesn't
It
it?
absolutely does. It forces you to look at the fundamental economics behind it, beyond just the political labels.
Totally. And to really get a grip on this bold claim and what it could mean for the U.S. economy and, for us, for consumers,
Right.
we're not just looking at The Telegraph.
Right.
We're also pulling in some thoughts from a YouTube video by the Ring of Fire that's talking about this exact report. So our mission today, basically, is to cut through the noise and figure out the reasoning. Why are they saying these tariffs are like a massive tax hike?
Precisely. We need to kind of piece together these arguments and see what the real-world effects might be for, well, everyday Americans.
Okay, so let's start with the source of the headline grabber, The Telegraph, Matthew Lynn's column. What's his main argument?
Well, Lynn's core point, as I see it, is pretty straightforward. He argues that the extra costs from these tariffs, they aren't just going to vanish or be eaten by the companies importing the goods. No, he reckons the much more likely outcome is that these costs get passed straight down the line to us, consumers.
Yeah.
Higher prices. It's like a reverse trickle down, maybe. Costs go up at the top, prices go up at the bottom.
Okay, so instead of tax breaks maybe creating jobs, we've got tariffs maybe leading to higher grocery bills, higher prices for everything. Does he explain how that happens?
He does, yeah. Lynn points to two main ways this price hike plays out. First, the obvious one, higher prices for stuff we import.
Right.
If there's a tariff on, I don't know, imported steel, then the car company using that steel pays more, and, well, guess what? The price of the car is probably going up.
Makes sense. Costs more to bring it in, costs more to buy it. Simple enough. What's the second way?
The second way is maybe a bit more subtle, but Lynn thinks it could be just as important. He argues that these tariffs, they kind of shield U.S. companies from foreign competition. He calls it a terror wall.
A terror wall. Okay.
Yeah. And because they're shielded, they might have less reason to innovate, get more efficient, improve productivity.
Yeah. Okay. So if your foreign competitor is suddenly more expensive because of a tariff, maybe the American company thinks, hey, I don't need to try quite so hard. I can maybe even nudge my prices up a bit.
Exactly that. Why bust a gut trying to be super efficient and cheap if the competition's been humbled? There's a risk they just raise prices because, well, they can. And that could mean prices go up generally, not just on the imported things.
Now, Lynn also talks about the money these tariffs might bring in, the revenue. But he puts it in context, right? Compares it to the whole U.S. economy.
He does. And this is crucial. He says, look, maybe the tariffs raise, say, $600 billion a year. Sounds like a lot of money, right?
Yeah, it definitely sounds substantial.
But then Lynn points out, compared to the size of the entire U.S. economy or the sheer scale of the federal budget, it's actually pretty small potatoes.
Just a drop in the bucket, relatively speaking.
Pretty much. So you've got this potential pain for consumers, these higher prices, but the potential gain in government revenue. Lynn is skeptical. It's really that significant.
So even if they do bring in billions, it's not going to fix the deficit or fundamentally change government spending overnight.
That's his argument. He even throws out a hypothetical, like, even if you made massive budget cuts, he mentions Elon Musk somehow cutting $1 trillion, which is obviously extreme, the kind of revenue you'd realistically get from these tariffs still wouldn't cover the government's annual bills.
He really tries to hammer home the scale issue with another example too, doesn't he? Something about replacing income tax.
Yeah, that was a striking one. To show how much you'd actually need, he calculates that tariffs would have to be at least 100%, maybe way higher, just to bring in the same amount as federal income tax.
Which would just crater global trade, obviously.
Completely. It would wreck the whole system. And, as Lynn points out, if trade collapses because tariffs are at 100%, well, guess what? There are no imports to tax.
Right. The revenue source disappears. It eats itself.
It's totally self-defeating. So pulling all that together, his conclusion is, pretty blunt.
Yeah, he doesn't hold back. He says Trump is imposing a huge tax rise, and the blunt truth is it'll crush the American economy, just like any other big tax hike.
Strong words. Especially, again, coming from the Telegraph. It definitely gives you pause.
It really does. Okay, so let's switch gears a bit. What about the other source we looked at, the Ring of Fire commentary on YouTube? How did their take line up with Lynn's?
Well, interestingly, they pretty much landed in the same spot. The commentator there strongly agreed with the basic idea. Tariffs, how they actually work, end up being a tax increase on Americans.
Okay, so agreement on the core conclusion. Did they get into the mechanics of how it's a tax? Who pays first?
Yeah, they really zeroed in on that. They stressed that it's the U.S. companies, the importers, who physically pay the tariff duty to the U.S. government when the goods come in.
Right, not the company in China or Mexico or wherever. It's the American company bringing the stuff in.
Exactly.
So how does that payment by the U.S. company turn into me paying more at the store?
Well, the commentator explained, these importing companies, they're businesses. They're generally not just going to absorb that extra cost and make less profit. The usual move is to pass that cost on to the next person in the chain, and eventually that's the consumer. And often they might even add a little extra on top, to protect or even boost their profit margin.
Right, got to cover the cost, plus maybe a bit more for the hassle or uncertainty. Do they have an example? I think you mentioned washers and dryers.
They did, and this was a really good illustration from Trump's first term. When tariffs went on imported washers and dryers, yeah, the price of the imported ones went up. No surprise there.
Okay.
But here's the kicker. The price of washing machines made in the U.S. also went up.
Huh. Even though they weren't hit by the import tariff directly, that feels backwards.
Exactly. The commentator suggested that the American manufacturers saw their chance. The price gap between their machines and the now pricier imports got smaller.
Oh.
So they raised their own prices. Not because their costs went up necessarily, but just because the market allowed them to. They could make more profit.
So the tariffs didn't just hurt importers. It gave domestic companies cover to raise prices too. Less competition means less pressure to keep prices low.
Precisely.
Right.
Which flies in the face of the idea that tariffs automatically make American companies, sharper or more innovative. Both Lynn and the commentator suggest it can just incentivize price gouging, essentially.
And did the Ring of Fire also touch on the revenue side, the idea that it's maybe not worth the economic pain?
Absolutely. They echoed Lynn completely on that. They argued that whatever revenue comes in is likely to be pretty tiny compared to overall government spending, especially when weighed against the hit to consumers and the wider economy. The commentator used the phrase virtually inconsequential, I think.
Virtually inconsequential. Wow. So, okay, let's try and synthesize this. We've got a conservative UK paper and a, let's say, more left-leaning US YouTube channel.
Right.
And they both seem to be saying, fundamentally, these tariffs act like a tax on American consumers, mostly showing up as higher prices.
That's the absolute core takeaway. Both sources trace the path. Tariffs increase costs for importers. Importers pass costs to consumers. Simple as that, really. And both are pretty skeptical about the upside, whether it's revenue or boosting industry.
And it's still pretty remarkable that the Telegraph, from their conservative viewpoint, is making this argument so strongly against a policy from a Republican figure. It really does suggest this might be less about politics and more about, basic economics.
I think that's fair. It points towards concerns grounded in economic principles, what happens when you interfere with trade, competition, market forces. The potential downsides seem to worry analysts across different ideological viewpoints.
Right. So wrapping this part up, our deep dive into the Telegraph and the Ring of Fire points to this strong argument. Trump's tariffs are being framed, even by conservatives, as a major tax hike on Americans. It hits us through higher prices, maybe affects both imported and domestic goods, and the benefits like government revenue or helping U.S. companies innovate are seen by these sources as questionable, or at least not enough to offset the costs.
Exactly. The picture they paint is one where the average American consumer potentially bears the brunt of this policy without a clear corresponding benefit for the government's books or a guaranteed boost to domestic industry.
Which brings us to the big question for everyone listening. If these perspectives are right, if tariffs function like a tax and might harm the economy more than they help, what are the other effects? The longer-term ones, maybe the less obvious ones? How could this reshape not just the U.S., but the whole global economy and eventually, our own wallets years down the line?
That's the real food for thought, isn't it? It forces you to think beyond just the price tag today and consider those ripple effects. How does this impact global supply chains, international relations, investment decisions? It's a complex web.
Definitely a lot to chew on there. It just shows how these big economic policies are never simple, and they deserve ongoing scrutiny way beyond just this one deep dive.